Hello. So I just want to do a little sort of talk through about Edwin S Porter and some of his editing achievements, whereby he's able to push cinema, right, moving pictures, into a storytelling medium. So this is Life of an American Fireman. We have the fireman. It's a really interesting shot. He seems to be sleeping, but there's that little vignette of a woman and a baby, and not quite sure what's going on here exactly. Is it a dream? Is it a kind of premonition? He gets up, seems a little disturbed. All right, exits frame. And now we cut to something that's unrelated. This is a call box, so if there was a fire, you would open the door, pull the lever, and there's a connection between that action at the call box and the fireman, clearly responding to the call. Porter was inspired by a film that had been made the year before in Great Britain, which had a similar subject of firemen doing their job. Porter had also used some footage that he recorded earlier the previous year. His cousin was a fireman, and so he shot some footage of them exiting the firehouse, and that's this footage here, thinking that it could be a short subject. But what he's done with Life of an American Fireman is sort of made a documentary of sorts. This might remind you of those single-shot scenes from the Lumiere brothers where they set up the camera and all the action just moves past the camera. I think for audiences today, we would expect the action to be cut a little faster. But for audiences in 1903, this was just captivating stuff. Films were never shown silently in theaters at this time. There would have been somebody there to recreate the sound effects. So if you can imagine somebody making the sound of horse hoofs with wooden blocks, and maybe bells clanging either from behind the screen or down in front. Porter actually here is panning the camera, which was a relatively new camera movement in 1903, and we see the house. Now it cuts to the simultaneous action, which is inside the house, and we revisit this woman again that we saw in the very beginning. So she's not new to us. We've seen her before. Of course, this is very melodramatic. Right? She faints. She's unable to save herself. She must rely on the firemen to rescue her. course, we knew that there was a child in that bed because we saw that at the very beginning. Porter is thinking about how the audience gets information. So he initially presents that information to us that the child's in the bed. And the firemen are addressing the fire. This, of course, is a set. Now watch what happens here. This is really interesting. We're back outside the house. And we see the firemen go in. Wait, the woman is out up in her window. And of course, we just saw her rescued, didn't we? And what Porter is doing here is not showing the action simultaneously. Some people had thought that maybe the scene was the uncut footage, because we would cut back and forth normally today between the outside and the interior. But that wasn't the case with this film. When these films were distributed, because they couldn't preview them for the theater owners if they had to ship them off, they were presented with a list of shots, and they would describe the shots in the film. And in this case, it describes the interior scenes, and then it describes the exterior scenes. So Porter has not quite figured it out. He wants to show simultaneous action, both inside the house and the exterior. But he hasn't thought through the problem. Now, audiences would not have minded this at all, seeing the scene from two different angles. And in their heads, they can put it all together. Now, later that year, in 1903, we have the Great Train Robbery. And Porter puts it together. He's able to employ a more sophisticated editing style in order to tell his story. There would have been some rousing music behind this of some kind. You know, we think about special effects as being a relatively modern invention, but what we have here is this set where they're shooting, and it's open to the sky. They're using daylight. And in the window to the right is another piece of footage that is double exposed into that space. And so they're kind of connecting two pieces of footage of film, one of a real train and one of the set, to create the setting on the side of the train tracks. This film is considered to be the first Western in cinema. The genre of the Western was very popular in traveling shows where people would sort of recreate events of the frontier. The West was more or less tamed by the 1870s, so to speak, tamed. And all of the sort of legends and mythologies of American expansion into the wilderness, into the frontier, was very well known. In fact, some of the legends of that era would travel around in sort of shows or circuses to perform various feats like sharpshooting. So this story is not would not be unfamiliar to audiences. Now watch what Porter does here. We see the train moving, and now we're back into a set with that same kind of special effect of the trees the landscape passing by. Quite an expressive performance here. And they got their sacks of money. Very interesting shot here. Porter puts the camera behind the engine on the train. We're running along with the train, riding along with it. There's a little special effect upcoming here. Called a stop camera technique. A little brutal. So we're still dealing with some very lengthy takes, but there is a variety to the shots. This is quite a production for Porter. Looking at probably close to or well over 100 extras. He had to acquire a train to use for the motion picture. Getting a body count here. Rousing music would have filled in the space. Likely they would have prescribed some kind of music that somebody would be familiar with already. A music score that might have been a common for people to play piano, for them to know, popular tune of the day, so that the people who would accompany the films with, let's say, piano, would already have kind of a repertoire to that they could pull from to play music. They wouldn't have to come up with something or read a score. Although sometimes there were notes that accompanied silent films that described a particular score. Very soon here, we're going to get to a part of the film that is really ingenious on the part of Porter. Here's another pan and tilt to try to cover the action. He's cutting the continuity, these lengthy takes. But he does something that's really interesting because it expands the possibility for storytelling in cinema. We're not just watching, in a moment, we're not just watching a single event and that's the only thing that's happening, but he is able to incorporate into the film multiple events occurring at the same time, and requiring the audience to kind of keep track of things. It's really interesting. It's going to come up here in a second. And they're off. Now look what he does. He cuts back to the very first location. The very first shot was here in this office. And what do we know? We're now following this part of the story where the guy is getting up. He's trying to save himself. He's exhausted. Perhaps becomes unconscious again. And what do we know is happening at the exact same time? The bad guys are getting away. And what this is called is parallel action. Because what Porter has done is he's established that the bad guys are getting away, but we're watching some other action. So two different sort of story paths are occurring at the same time. So when these early films were screened, it wasn't uncommon for them to be shown where there was also live performances. And so we have this action here, this dance, right? And this, I guess, funny thing with the guy getting shot at his feet to make him dance. And so we have this kind of folksy music and or dance. And it's a little interlude. Here's our station guy, station master, train office worker, calling out, and these are the good guys, by the way. And now we pick up with the story. We're now at the scene where the bad guys are getting away. So we've cut from that action back in the town. Now we're out on the trail, and it looks like they've caught up to him pretty quickly. Looks like they've made their escape. Porter does something really interesting here. He's got this background action, so now our eyes travels up to the top of the frame. He's providing us with a lot of information through the juxtaposition of the characters in the scene. And they're fighting to the last. And the money has been recovered. The robbery has been foiled. And then here's this really interesting shot. This is one of the bad guys. Takes aim at the audience and empties his gun. kind of a profound symbolic shot that describes the power of cinema back at the audience. So this is Porter's contribution to cinema and editing, and how editing contributes to advancing the storytelling possibilities from single takes of the everyday world to actual storytelling in cinema.